So it wasn't all about security. But it was about protection. And so really trying to just reframe that for people, I think, is a big thing of understanding that the goal of that safety team, security team, whatever language you want to use, is not about putting some big presence on, but is actually about helping people feel comfortable and safe where they're at.
Well, hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Lightwell Podcast. We've talked a lot on this podcast about stewardship of all kinds, financial stewardship, stewardship of risk. Today, we're going to be talking about specifically the stewardship of safety and security within your ministry for everyone in the congregation, kids, adults, your pastors, everyone. And to do that, we're bringing in my friend Steve Bensema. He's an agent with Lightwell in the state of Iowa, and he's got some great insights because before he was with Lightwell, he was actually a pastor. So he's seen this issue from both sides within the ministry and now from the perspective of someone who's an advocate for ministries. So he's got some great things to say. Grab a pen and a pad, and let's get right into our conversation with Steve Bensema. Well, it is my pleasure to be joined by Steve Bensema. He is an agent with Lightwell in the state of Iowa. He's been with Lightwell for just over a year, and we are super glad to have him as a part of the Lightwell team and also on the podcast. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, we've covered this topic before on the podcast, and we cover a range of risk management issues, but we're going to be talking today about safety and security within ministries, and would love your perspective on this because I know you come at it with a unique perspective. So can you share a bit about your story and particular interest in the area of ministry safety and security?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually, before coming to work for Lightwell, I got to serve as a pastor for about 7 years at 2 different churches. And so both of those churches had safety teams that were part of it. And it was something that I really learned almost too much about in some ways. This quick story on that, I remember with the church plant that I had helped plant and pastor, I had one guy that was just super passionate about church safety. And so he basically just asked for carte blanche to run and said, yes, do it, because I don't know what we need to do there. And I remember coming back to him later and I was like, hey, as you're doing everything, can I be part of the team? Like I got my conceal and carry permit, would love to kind of be on the team, like just train with you guys. And he was like, absolutely not. I was like, what do you mean? Absolutely not. And he was like, if there's an incident, you're the target. I was like, whoa, hold on. Nobody ever told me this part when I was like agreeing to this whole pastor gig. Like, what do you mean I'm the target? And he was like, if somebody comes in here, their number one goal is going to be to stop the guy that's speaking. So our job is to get you off stage, and then somebody else begins to diffuse the situation. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. So 2 things. 1, thank you for doing what you're doing. And 2, never tell my wife that we had this conversation. And so, it was one of those things, like being I was a realtor for 8 years before becoming a pastor. So just being part of a church and knowing that there was a safety security team, and I didn't really understand what the threat was. I didn't really understand what was going on. But then having sat in that seat of being the lead pastor of a church and beginning to understand a little bit more of like, okay, this actually is a bigger deal than I realized, and something that we're really now sitting on this side of the table, getting to sit with pastors and beginning to share stories that we hear from other churches. Understanding like, yeah, this is a real threat, and this is something that's good to be aware of, prepare for, and just be able to love your people and shepherd your people well in the middle of a hard moment.
That's absolutely right. And because you have that unique experience, I'm sure you can meet pastors wherever they are on the continuum of what they believe or think about safety and security issues in their church. But what would you say the most common starting point is for pastors and ministry leaders when you're talking about safety and security? What do they think you're talking about?
So they typically, I think, go to like armed security guards, T-shirts with like security printed on it and those kind of things. And I really try to like walk them back from that. And so even at the church I pastored, we used more of a safety team kind of terminology. So within that team, we had people who were either military trained, police trained, that were kind of the eyes and ears paying attention and watching. But we also had people on that team that were trained as EMTs and nurses. So if somebody got hurt, safety team stepped in. So it wasn't all about security. It was about protection. And so really trying to just reframe that for people, I think, is a big thing of understanding that the goal of that safety team, security team, whatever language you want to use, is not about putting some big presence on, but is actually about helping people feel comfortable and safe where they're at.
We've talked about this word a bunch on this podcast over the course of all the episodes we've done, stewardship. And we've talked about it sometimes from the perspective of finances, but often we've talked about it on this podcast from the standpoint of expanding that definition to be more inclusive of what are you doing to do the best thing for your people, to take care of them, stewarding the people resource in your ministry the best way possible. So with this topic in mind, safety and security, how do you move pastors from a posture of fear related to safety and security to this is just you taking great care or stewarding your people well?
You can steward any resource that you have. And so you think through financial stewardship, absolutely makes sense. People stewardship, yes. But what about the building or the asset or the venue or the location or whatever those are going to look like? And so having a building is awesome. So in the church plant that I worked at, we did set up and tear down in a YMCA gym. So we didn't have that building, but we had like an office space. And my goal was if we can get the community to use this space as much as possible, that's a win. And so you begin to think through that. And it's like, but the stewardship part of that, the danger side of that is the more that you open up your building to the community, the more that you invite people in, the higher the risk there is that something could happen or something could go wrong. And so how do you understand that God has gifted you with a building, a location, a venue, whatever you have, and use that for the glory of the kingdom? And part of that is going to be, how do you keep people safe while they're in your space?
And you had mentioned several roles when you were talking about the safety team, not just the security team, but the safety team. You had mentioned several roles, EMT, people who are maybe trained in nursing, other aspects of a holistic view of safety. So when you speak with ministry leaders and pastors about safety and security, what are some of those aspects that don't come as intuitively to them, that they might underestimate or overlook when thinking about this issue?
So from a team standpoint, I think when they start thinking through that nursing side or the EMT side, I think that's something that kind of gets missed or not thought about. But you think about, I was in the middle of preaching. We had a pretty young church, but this high school girl just all of a sudden faints in the middle. Like, I'm like 3 minutes into the message, and all of a sudden this girl just like flat hits the ground, and I see these like chairs starting to like slide away. And like by God's grace, like the person sitting right in front of her was a doctor, and so like he was able to step in right away and start figuring out what was going on. And so having those people with that medical experience, or you take another situation, if you have a church with an older congregation and somebody has a heart attack in the middle of service and you need somebody trained to use the AED that's on the wall if your church has one, it's a lot. So all those different areas of how do you keep people safe and secure in the building, whether it's from an outside threat or just age or health or whatever different things that could be too.
Those are all components of safety and security, even though they're not the one that, is the most tragic or visible in the headlines. Those are important too, of course. But when you think about this topic, you ought to work from the day-to-day mundane, it can and will happen because these are the people in your congregation, and then work your way outward toward those extreme examples. And then, obviously, and this is part of why we're here today, to have an insurance plan that contemplates safety and security as a part of it. So let's open that up a little bit. How do you use insurance to help build out a comprehensive safety and security plan for a ministry?
Regarding having an insurance plan around safety and security, I'd say there's really multiple avenues and multiple prongs to that approach. So I'll just kind of go through a list of a few things of areas that we help churches. One that people don't think about, and I'm sure you guys have already covered this on the podcast, but cybersecurity. And so that's one thing where, yes, it's not the physical threat, but especially when a church is going through a building campaign or something like that, that's typically where we see the most issues of some sort of fraudulent issues of scams and different things, where we've had churches pay from $40,000 to $1.4 million in fraudulent bills and not realize it. And so coming alongside of a church in the appropriate way to be able to help with cybersecurity and that piece of it. Think through child safety, which is a big thing when that I want to make sure we come back to as well, hopefully on this. But you think through child safety of kids. How do you keep the kids safe in the kids ministry? But then you also think through from an actual policy standpoint, there's things that are built into the brotherhood policy, which is actually one of the reasons that I love that relationship and partnership between Lightwell and Brotherhood, because there's things built in that we get to come alongside a church or come alongside a ministry and help them when something goes wrong. And so we can help on the proactive side. We can help on coming up with plans and procedures and policies. But what about when something does go wrong? And being able to be there with that church, be there with that ministry and that. And so one of those things is the safety and security liability coverage that we offer. A hesitation that I've heard a lot of different churches talk about of why they don't want a safety team is they don't want the liability, because most other companies won't cover that liability. And so if we can actually come alongside the church and help them know both you and your people are actually protected in this policy, if something goes wrong, we've got your back. We will walk with you in this. And then the other side of that is that traumatic incident response coverage, being able to, in that worst case scenario when the unthinkable has happened in the ministry setting, being able to come alongside that church, come alongside that pastor and help them say, hey, we can help cover some funeral costs for you. We can provide counseling costs for you. We can hire a PR firm to help walk with you through this. And those kind of things. The church that I got planted out of, there was actually a church shooting in that parking lot shortly before we launched, or kind of in that time frame. And it really had nothing to do with the church itself. It was a disgruntled ex-boyfriend that ended up tracking down his ex-girlfriend in the parking lot, ended up shooting her best friend, and then turning the gun on himself with 700 college students around. And you think about the difficulty of that. You think about the amount of trauma that is experienced in that moment. And then you start thinking through as a church leadership and as a pastor, okay, how do we love our people well? And you think of the average church budget, and you start thinking through, okay, cost of funerals, cost of helping with counseling, that can get devastating from a budget standpoint. And that's one of those things where I love to come alongside that pastor and say, hey, look, I want you to be the hero of your story. So if something goes wrong, we get to come alongside you and help you love your people well.
Wow, that's really good and so devastatingly real. Unfortunately, heartbreakingly real. And that is that's why those, I mean, you mentioned them. There's those two coverages that I think work hand in hand: security operations liability and traumatic incident response liability. And the thing you highlighted about all those kids in that parking lot is they weren't directly involved in that incident, but man, were they directly impacted by it. And so having a coverage that goes way beyond just the two or other 3 or 4 other people that were directly involved in it, to make sure that the well-being, the counseling, is taken care of as much as the coverage will allow. I think that is very, very unique about the policy that Lightwell offers, and there's specific details within the security operations that are unique as well. One of them that I hear about, and maybe you hear about this when you're out there talking to ministries, is with a security team. One of the core questions is, can they be armed or not? And that's, it's like this litmus test of whether or not a church is actually interested in real for real safety and security or not. But some churches don't want that. And the cool thing I think about the way that coverage comes alongside a church, and I'm sorry, I'm doing a lot of talking. You can fill in gaps if you see them, but I think it's really, what do you as a church believe about what it means to take great care of your ministry? And this coverage is designed to help you stand by your beliefs in that way. If this is how you want to structure your team, then the coverage responds in that way. So it's not dictatorial about how safety is meant to be handed out. It's saying we've got coverage for your team. That's why this exists. I don't know. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I always tell them, whether you have a formal team or an informal team, as long as there's some aspect of it, and whether they carry or not, we don't ask those questions. We don't expect them to ask those questions, but whether they do or they don't, we've got them covered on that. And so, because you're right, it's every church is going to have a different thought on that. And even you might have people within one safety team that have a different thought on whether they want to carry or not. And so it's one of those things where it's like we get to come alongside no matter what. Now, what's interesting is, again, because that coverage is unique to us, we had there was a school shooting that happened in Iowa here a couple years back, at a high school, super tragic incident. And after that, a bunch of, because nobody thinks it's going to happen until it does. And so after that happened, a bunch of local schools in that area started kind of asking around, like, okay, can we have armed people? And all of those insurance companies that work in the public school space said absolutely not. But that conversation got to a couple of Christian schools that we insure in the state. And they were like, well, hey, our company lets us. Our company will cover us. And so we had different like public school entities contacting us years ago. This was before I was with Lightwell. But in talking to Terry, who just retired after 28 years, he was saying he was getting public schools calling him and saying, can you guys insure us? And he was like, sorry, that's not that sweet spot for brotherhood. So no, but that's such a unique coverage that we can really be able to, again, it's about standing with them when something goes wrong.
We're talking about a really sensitive topic when it comes right down to it. You gave that example of what happened there in that parking lot, and that's incredibly sensitive and overwhelming. And so to get a church or a ministry leader to understand the risk without overwhelming them is a delicate art. So how do you approach pastors and get them to understand how sensitive, because you're right. Unfortunately, nobody thinks it's going to happen to them until it does. That's awful. And so how do you try to get proactive without being a fear monger and helping people understand what the risks actually are here?
I don't ever try to like be a fear monger, but I do want. You ever been in like the middle of like a preaching moment and the pastor just like lets something hit and just like lets that pause, that pregnant pause, just like devastate you a little bit with hearing the reality of that? I like using that when I'm working with a ministry sometimes, where it's again around the safety team and around child protection are kind of those two areas that I feel like most often people are like, we're a small church, that's not going to happen, or that's never going to happen here. And on those two things, I'll approach them a little bit different, but on the child safety, I'll typically talk about like, well, you're familiar with the phrase that electricity and water will always follow the path of least resistance. So do sex offenders. And so what you're telling me by saying that we're a small church and we know everybody, we don't need to do background checks, is you are telling the community that you are potentially the path of least resistance for a sex offender to get access to kids in your community. And that hits because it's real. And after they have a chance to digest that, then we get to come alongside and say, now my role is to help your church not be the path of least resistance in your community.
Well, then let's follow up on that, because you got me hanging on your every word. So then you've accurately pointed out why this is such a tender and risky situation for the church's most precious resource, their children that are in their care. So what's next? How then do you help build the church back up towards safety for those kids?
Our agency has a relationship with a ministry called Ministries. And so that's who we've typically worked with. And so what we offer to the customers that we work with is we actually cover the cost for them to be part of Ministries for the first year. And so what that gets them access to is access to the best child protection awareness training that I've been a part of. And again, I was in pastoral ministry for 7 years, lay leadership for years before that. And the training that I went through was by far the best training of that. Access to good in-depth continuous background checks, and just a litany of library resources to be able to help to figure out what do they need to build out? What are those policies? What are those procedures? And so what we want to do is not force people to do stuff, whether it's in child protection or just church safety in general. We're not going to come and like force these things, but we're going to say, hey, look, here's where you're at risk. And here's a bunch of resources that we are going to be open-handed with and help you with as much as you want. And being able to get those resources in people's hands is a huge piece. And I also have the conversation with churches sometimes on the child safety piece of it, where they'll kind of say like, well, I'd like to do background checks, but people keep saying that they don't really want to. And so I give those ministry leaders carte blanche to blame me. And so I tell them, you can go back to your people and say, hey, our insurance guy, he's a little hard on this, and he's making me do this. Like, blame me. Like, I'm totally fine with that. Like, blame me for protecting your kids. Like, I will take that blame to take that off of you as much as you need to.
That's so good. That's so good. Um, okay, so this is maybe stepping backward, although you could totally stay in the vein of taking good care of kids, but maybe taking a step back to the just broader topic of safety and security. If there's one step or tip that you would say, this is a most common thing that, like, if ministries just did this, they're typically not doing this, and this would improve their overall preparedness. Is there a small tip like that? Maybe it's got to do with the building. Every church has a place they meet in. I don't know.
Maybe not just one. I'll maybe give a few. Maybe we'll do the whole Proverbs thing of 6 yet 7. So I'm not sure how long this list is going to be yet.
Sure.
So number one, a simple step that churches and ministries could take is contact your local police department or sheriff's department. Most of the time, they'll come through and do a walkthrough and just do kind of a safety check for the building for no cost, to my knowledge. And so you want to figure out where your building's vulnerable, bring in the experts. And you don't have to hire a consultant for $5,000 or something like that. Just call the local police station and say, hey, we're wanting to be more aware of this. Can you just come walk through? And they'll help you figure out, okay, which doors you want to make sure are always locked, which ones could be opened, who do you have around those doors, and just put that plan in place, but identify where those weak points are. And then from there, kind of step 2 would be you begin to put a plan in place. And so part of that plan is going to be the actual safety piece of it. Who do you want to have on the team? How do you want to approach that? But then also the back end of that is having that plan in place of if something goes wrong, what do we do? And maybe it's kind of that decision tree idea or something like that, where in different scenarios or different cases, because typically, again, when I'm sitting down with a church pastor talking about the importance of a safety team or even the role of that traumatic coverage that we have, typically in the extreme case, it is that church shooting that happens. It is something extreme that happens there. On the less extreme, somebody has a heart attack in the middle of service and dies. That could be traumatic. Now, what's the plan of how do you respond to that? Who are the people that, if there's media inquiries, who talks to the media? How do you talk to the media? How do you deal with the family? What are those steps to make sure that you're prepared and ready for those kind of things and having some plan in place? Now, I'm not saying like you need to go like full Leslie Knope, like 3-inch binder, like in Parks and Rec, we got that. Like we're not like an emergency preparedness situation, but like have something in place at least where you can begin to like plan through if something happens, who's talking, how are we talking, and what are we beginning to do with this?
Excellent Parks and Rec reference, by the way. That was great.
Thank you. Figured I'd toss that one in there for you.
That was well done. Coming back to this idea of what role insurance plays in the overall safety and security of a ministry, where does the insurance support end and just good proactive planning that's not the insurance policy begin? Like, what's that relationship?
Great question. So when you're kind of talking about these issues, you kind of think of like a policy sandwich. You've got your policies and procedures of how are you going to act, and then you've got your policy to protect you on the back end, and then there's everything that happens in the middle. And so we want to help on the policies and procedures. And so that's, again, where we can be open-handed with churches. The amount of resources on brotherhoodmutual.com, the amount of resources from something like Ministries Safe or some other child protection policy program, whoever a church is going to work with, the amount of resources that are there that we can get you access to is innumerable. The beg, borrow, steal from other groups, like whatever you need, we will help you get those resources on that. And then again, on the back end, we'll have the policies, the insurance policies to help protect if needed and when needed. But that middle section is really the part where we need the church to really take the initiative. And so we can give you everything, but if you're not going to begin to put those in place, both in practicality and in like just legitimately having the policy and then beginning to live those things out, that's something we can't force to do. I'm not going to be in their church every Sunday morning making sure that the back door is locked or something of that nature. And so we want to give the resources, be a resource, but at the end of the day, that's kind of where that proactive piece really kind of needs to shift over to the church.
You mentioned earlier, here's a few tips, here's a few thoughts on what you could change, but what additional advice might you have on next steps for ministries who beyond just having a safety plan for their building, want to think creatively about equipping or training? Like, I don't know, what do you see? What's happening for churches you work with?
Yeah, great question. So there's one of the churches in our area that we worked with. They believe so much in this that they actually wanted to bring in a consultant to do a conference. And so they opened up a church safety conference. They contacted our agency. We ended up sponsoring that in some form. I forget if we brought in lunch or whatever it was. But because it's like, hey, this is one of our pillars that we want to be strong on. This is something you're passionate about. This makes sense for us to help you on this. And so we got to come alongside that church, and we opened it up where we invited all of the churches that we insure, all of the prospects that we'd like to insure, just because it was one of those things where I was like, whether we work with you or not, this is something you need to be aware of. This church is putting this on in your backyard or an hour drive or whatever it is. Come hear this expert talk about this thing so you can take some nuggets back and figure out what you do with that. On the back end with that, we're another group right now. There's a Baptist convention here in Iowa that's wanting to do some stuff around child protection policy training. And so they've got some people from the Southern Baptist Convention that are going around to different states and putting something on. So we're going to come alongside and we're going to provide lunch for that day. Because again, here's a group of churches and they're going to open it up to all churches, not just people within their own denomination, but there's certain areas where, like, as a Lightwell agency, if you as a church or you as a ministry are saying this is important to us and it's also important to us, that's an easy partnership where we'd love to come alongside and try to figure out how do we work with you in what you're doing and really enhance and make that a great event for you.
That's awesome. I love that idea. It's a supportive posture. Now, we've talked a lot about a lot of scary stuff and sensitive and important stuff today. If you were to leave a ministry leader who's listening to this conversation with a, kind of a piece of encouragement related to this, so that it didn't feel like, oh boy, maybe they're just feeling bug-eyed at this point, like this is a lot of stuff that could go wrong for me. How would you leave our listeners with any encouragement today?
That's a great question. Because at the end of the day, as an insurance agent, we don't want to just scare people and scare people and scare people. We want them to be encouraged. And I think the thing I would leave them with is you could do all of the right planning. You could have all of the right policies and procedures in place. And something could still go wrong. And that's what we're going to be there for. And so it's the old Mike Tyson quote, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And so when that happens, when something goes wrong, we want to be there with them. But the reason and the thing I would leave them to encourage them is as a pastor, as a leader of a ministry, you're charged with shepherding your people well. You're not the ultimate shepherd. We got Jesus as the over shepherd. We are the under shepherd, and we want to help love people well. And this is one area where, if we can take some proactive steps just to be aware of what's going on in the community, aware of what's going on around us, and remember that Romans 1 is real, where Paul says that people are inventors of all kinds of evil. Man, we see that all the time in and out of churches. And so we live in a hostile world, hostile environment, and sometimes there are people that really don't like what the church is doing. And so recognize that there is a threat. We are here to help you prevent it. We're here to help you if something goes wrong. And we're here to just come alongside with our arm around you in the middle of that whole thing too, just to help walk with you and what you need.
That's so good. And I think it points to, short of this podcast ever just being a commercial for our Lightwell, advisors and agents across the country, it does speak to how important it is to have a support that's not necessarily a person in your congregation, but is someone who understands these unique things and understands them specifically for the ministry context. And so the expertise and the background that you have to be a voice in that pastor's life that says, here are the things that could happen, and here's the things you do next if they do happen. That's a pretty big deal. And so that's why we always encourage, even if it's not Lightwell, find someone you can talk to about this that feels like an advocate for what's best for your ministry. That is bottom line table stakes when it comes to not just this risk in the insurance world, but all of them. So yes, that's a great encouragement. Now, one last question for you. We've been asking everybody this, and I'd love your perspective, especially because you're still fairly new in your career working with Lightwell. As you've been at this for the last year, what's something that you're seeing or experiencing that's keeping you going, keeping you inspired to keep after this work?
I miss pastoring some days. And I love serving the church still. So for me, got to pastor for 7 years. Now I get to serve the church in this new way. But the great thing is that I get to still love pastors and still love people that are leading ministries. And so then that thing that gets me to just keep going. I was meeting with a pastor one time. We were working at a bunch of things. I called her to follow up with her later, and she was like, "Hey, I'm so sorry I've not gotten to that stuff. I've been dealing with several funerals within my own church. I have a cousin that just passed away. A best friend of mine back home just passed away." And so it was like within like a 2-month period, there was like 7 or 8 funerals or more that she was having to deal with. And we're just like, "Hey, can we just put insurance to the side for a second?" And she's like, "Yeah." I was like, "How are you?" And she just stopped on the phone. She's like, "Nobody's asked me that." I was like, "I know. I've been in that chair. But how are you?" And so we just talked about how she was doing for a little while and just kind of encouraged her, like, "Hey, right now you're in the middle of it. But when you get through some of these, please take some time to rest. Please take some time just to be. You're pouring out a lot right now. You're doing a lot right now. But just make sure you can just have some time just to be again." And so I think in those moments where there's a lot of insurance companies that try to write churches. Not all of them do it well, and I do think that Brotherhood's the best in that space. And the agents that we have here in Iowa and the agents that I've met across the country so far, so many of them have a background in ministry. And so in a way, I'm not an official pastor of pastors, but I get to see a little bit of what I do of getting to come alongside and just to love well for the pastors and the churches that we get to work with.
That is awesome. Steve Bensema, agent for Lightwell in the state of Iowa. Thank you for that. On behalf of the ministries that you work with in the state of Iowa, thank you for serving them in this way. And thank you also for your insights about safety and security in all kinds of ways in this conversation. I know it's been helpful to those who listen. So until the next time you're on the podcast, thank you so much for being a part of it, Steve.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
My thanks once again to Steve Bensema, agent with Lightwell in the state of Iowa, for his insights and his care for ministries everywhere, and their safety and their security and the safety of the children in particular that they care for. I hope this was really helpful to you as a ministry leader, but if this raised any questions about whether or not you are as prepared as you can be, a great first place to start, like he said, call local law enforcement. See what they would do to come to your facility and help you assess what you need. But then also, you've always got an advisor in your area. Through lightwell.com, you can find out who's in your area that could meet with you and help you understand what your ministry needs to be prepared for anything that could happen within your church. So thanks for joining us today. My thanks once again to Steve. And until the next episode of the podcast, let's go and let it shine.